Hello, everyone. Shavua Tov and Good Vach. It is so wonderful to see everyone. I was just taking a Shabbos walk earlier today, taking a nice walk with Brooke and with our children, and we were walking, and we ran into some friends of ours, and we were talking, and the couple had mentioned that they were thinking and discussing about Shabbat HaGadol this year, and that they were so thrilled over the fact that we as a Jewish people have a tremendous knack of being able to find the silver lining in everything. And we had spoken about how, that's exactly what our role is as Jews, right? We have to have Emunah, and Emunah prescribes and motivates us to be able to find the silver lining in everything, because ultimately it all comes from Hashem. And the silver lining they suggested of the Shabbat HaGadol Drasha is the fact that we had a Shabbat HaGadol Drasha in person, which Baruch Hashem, thank God, was well attended, and we learned together as a community preparing for Pesach. And now again, we have all of us together over Zoom, learning together as we come closer to the Yontiv, is truly a silver lining with everything that is going on in the world. Every single family has their Pesach Seder shtick. So particularly in my home growing up, a classic was how long it would take one of our cousins to spill the wine, but not just spill the wine, but to break the glass that the wine was in. Another classic one, perhaps my favorite, was that throughout the Seder, there were goodies that my father would pass around to all the kids as he would ask them questions that were age appropriate. When the youngest of the siblings or cousins would stand on the chair and sing the Manashtana, my dad would throw them a marshmallow. And when we got to whoever won the Afikomen got the Afikomen, got some candy. And all the different parts in the Seder, we try and get the kids engaged. And so my father did a great job keeping all of us engaged, all of us into it, because my mom bought some great candy, some good marshmallows, some good, delicious snacks to keep us all engaged and a part of it. One of those particular highlights was the classic question that I think probably many, many people ask their children on Pesach night. That as we go through the order of Kadesh, Orchas, Karpas, Yachatz, we get to the section of Orchatz. What's Orchatz? Orchatz is when we go to wash our hands before Karpas. And the classic question, my father would say, okay, everyone, all the children, what are we going to do now? And everyone would say, oh, we're going to go wash our hands. Okay, whoever said that, you got yourself a marshmallow. And then the more advanced question. The more advanced question was, now the washing we're going to be doing now during Orchatz, is that washing with a bracha or without a bracha? And the answer, of course, is without a bracha. And if you answer correctly, you got yourself another marshmallow. Now, blessings are part and parcel of the Seder experience. There's many, many blessings that we make throughout the evening. Starting with Kadesh, we make blessings during Kadesh, and we make blessings throughout the Seder by Mar and by Matzah and benching, of course, and all of the blessings. There are many, many blessings that we make throughout the Seder evening, blessing of Asher Go'alanu, and many blessings we make throughout the evening. But there's one blessing that seems to be awkwardly omitted. There's one blessing that just seems to not be there, even though it should be there. And it's just puzzling why it isn't. What is the bracha that's awkwardly omitted from the Seder? That is the bracha of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Making a blessing on the mitzvah of the evening, the hallmark mitzvah of telling over the story of the Exodus. We have a commandment from the Torah to tell over the story of the Exodus from Egypt that is upon every single person in Klal Yisrael. And yet, this mitzvah does not have a blessing associated with it. And we know that we make a blessing upon the fulfillment of all mitzvahs that we do. Many, many, many mitzvahs. Blowing shofar, eating matzah, sitting in a sukkah, shaking lulav, lighting Shabbos candles, lighting Hanukkah candles, all have blessings associated with them. why is it that the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mitzvah to tell over the story of the Exodus, does not have a blessing associated with it? So I'm going to share my screen here so we can appreciate this mitzvah that we have and this question of why is there no blessing on the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim a little bit better. Take a look at what it says in the Rambam. The Rambam tells us that there is an obligation, and you can follow either in the Hebrew sources or you can follow in the English sources. The Rambam says in source number 1 that there's a mitzvah upon every single Jew to tell over the story of the Exodus. He shitzivanu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim b'leil chamisha asar menisan. That there is an obligation upon every single Jew the night of the 15th of Nisan to tell over the story of the Exodus. At the end of the Rambam, he writes, V'kfar yadas lashon amram, he picks out the language. He picks on the language of the Haggadah that we say at the end of the paragraph. We say in the paragraph of Avadim Ayinu, Va'afilu kulanu chachamim, that even if we were all wise, kulanu nevonim, even if we were all bright, even if we were all intuit, kulanu yodim es haTorah kula, even if we know the entire Torah, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what you are obligated to tell over the story. Even if you know the story, you're obligated to tell the story. So if that is the case, why is there no blessing associated with it? So there are a number of fascinating answers to this question. I'd like to point out a few that really stuck out to me. Number one, in source number 2, we find from the Pri Chadash. The Pri Chadash, Reich da Silva was a Sephardic Achron who lived in Tuscany, in Italy, that he was a Sephardic posek. He had a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch that was and still is highly regarded as being a work that is a commentary that is really, really worked out. It is very clear. It is very it's designed and structured in a way that it is obvious that the analytical mind of the Pri Chadash is a very, very difficult one to argue with. So learning the sections of the Pri Chadash are very exciting because you know that he's coming with a real sense of authority. Says the Pri Chadash in his laws in the commentary of in his commentary on the laws of Pesach and his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes, V'im Tomar, he asks the question that we're posing, that why is there no blessing on the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story? Lama ein mevarchim al ha'agada. Why is there no blessing on the Haggadah of telling over the story of the Exodus? V'haksiv, after all, the Torah does tell us v'higadat lebincha, that we have an obligation to tell over the story to our children. So then if that's the case, why is there no blessing associated with it? Says the Pri Chadash the following, V'yesh lomar d'b'yetzias Mitzrayim, that you could answer the following, that when it comes to Yetzias Mitzrayim, we already recognized it. We already recognized Yetzias Mitzrayim sheniskar b'kiddush, when we make kiddush. Meaning, says the Pri Chadash, the blessing I made at kiddush fulfills my obligation not just of Kaddish, fulfilling my obligation of sanctifying the evening, my obligation of Kiddush, but also my obligation of making a blessing upon telling over the story. There, during Kaddish, when I make that blessing, since I recognize the Yetzias Mitzrayim, I recognize the Exodus during that blessing, that is how I fulfill my mitzvah. Says the Pri Chadash. It is for this reason that I do not make an additional blessing. Based on this Pri Chadash, by the way, it should be noted that when a person makes Kiddush on Seder night, they should have in mind that I am making a blessing not just for Kaddish, but I'm also having in mind that I have to have this blessing also go on my mitzvah of the evening of telling over the story of the Exodus. So this is one answer from the Pri Chadash, that the blessing was made during Kiddush. Another answer, another fascinating answer we find in source number 3 from Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, his father was a student of the Brisker Rav. His family's from Brisk. They then moved to Yerushalayim. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, I believe, was born in Yerushalayim even before the establishment of the state. He gained acclaim as a halachic authority, as a Torah scholar. He then moved to, of all places, Memphis, Tennessee. In Memphis, Tennessee, and he gained worldwide fame as being a posek, a halachic decider. He was a contemporary with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein held Rav Ephraim Greenblatt at a high regard. And Rav Ephraim Greenblatt recorded many of his responsa in the book titled Rivivos Ephraim. And in the book Rivivos Ephraim, he has a long response regarding the laws of Pesach. And over there, he addresses our question. The question of, why is there no blessing on the obligation to tell over the story of the Exodus? Says Rav Ephraim Greenblatt, Hatam dein mevarchim al ha'Haggadah. The reason we do not make a blessing on the Haggadah, he said, I heard from B'Shem Harav Mipanovich. He heard from the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman. Rabbi Kahaneman was the Rav of the town of Panovich. Unfortunately, the town of Panovich, along with too many other communities in Europe that were absolutely destroyed by the Nazis, and Rav Kahaneman, the only surviving member of his family, his wife was murdered, his children were murdered. He was a sole survivor that then went after the war to the land of Israel, to Bnei Brak, and he, along with his counterpart, the Chazon Ish, Rav Avram Shai Karelitz, built up an oasis of Torah inside of a spiritual desert that was the land of Israel at that time. They built the Bnei Brak community, which acted as a center to be able to spread Torah Judaism throughout the land of Israel. Said the Panovich Rav, here is the reason why we do not make a blessing on the mitzvah, on the commandment to tell over the story of the Exodus. Says the Panovich Rav, Mishum, because the hu mitzvahs Talmud Torah. Because, says the Panovich Rav, an answer that in and of its own right deserves its own Shabbat HaGadol Drasha. It's an amazing answer with a lot of depth and a lot of lessons. But just to be able to cite his answer, he says that the night of the Seder, we tell over the story of the Exodus. And in telling over the story of the Exodus, we use the Haggadah to guide us in doing so. That, he says, is really under the umbrella of the general mitzvah that we have every single day of the year of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah. That this is just an application of the mitzvah of learning Torah the night of the Seder. It's a specific prescription of the type of learning that should be done, but nevertheless, it's learning Torah. And if it's learning Torah, so then I already made a blessing on learning Torah. When did I make a blessing on learning Torah? In the morning. Shetzivsa haTorah lidros v'lilmod. That the Torah already commanded that we learn and we analyze the whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of the 15th. V'kfar birech al zeh. And I already made a blessing for this. I already made a blessing for learning Torah. When was this? Baboker, says the Panovich Rav, in the morning. Ve'ein sarach lachzor levarich. So I don't need to now make another blessing. I don't need to now make another blessing. In fact, says Rabbi Soloveitchik that because of the fact that the Haggadah is a unique type of Torah learning, that's why we say a special type of Birchas HaTorah when we say Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu Baruch Shenasan Torah La'amo Yisrael. That paragraph of the Haggadah is supposed to act as a sort of blessing on the Torah because of the unique nature of the Haggadah being part and parcel of the mitzvah, the umbrella mitzvah of learning Torah. But says the Rivos Ephraim, says the Panovich Rav, that there is no need to make a new blessing now on the mitzvah to tell over the story of the Exodus, because I already made a blessing on the mitzvah to learn the story of the Exodus in the morning, when I made a blessing on learning Torah in general. So we already have two beautiful answers to the question. Why is there no blessing on the mitzvah to tell over the story? Number one, from the Pri Chadash, we do make a blessing during Kiddush. And during Kiddush, I should have in mind that when I speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim, I speak about the Exodus while I make Kiddush, that is also a blessing on the mitzvah to tell over the story itself. Says the Panovich Rav, another answer, that I already made a blessing earlier in the day when I made a blessing on learning Torah in general. And this, the telling over the story of the Exodus, is an aspect of Torah learning. But then I came to the answer of the Rush. And when I came across this answer from the Rush, I kid you not, I almost fell out of my seat. Maybe I didn't actually almost fall out of my seat, but I was totally taken aback by this Rush. Now, who's the Rush? His mother did not call him Rushala. She didn't say, Rushala, do you remember to take out the garbage, Rushala? Rushala, did you remember to clean up your toys, Rushala? His name was not Rush. What was his name? His name was Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel. Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel lived a fascinating 76 years of life. That from 1250 till 1301, he was living in the land of Frankfurt and Mainz, in the land of Ashkenaz. He was an Ashkenaz posek and Rishon and gained world-renowned fame in that regard as an Ashkenaz posek. And then in the year 1301, he moved to Toledo, Spain. He befriended the Rashba, Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderet, the chief rabbi of Toledo. The two of them became very close, and the Rush was very much influenced by the Rashba. And in fact, those last 25, 26 years of his life, the Rush became like a Sephardic Rishon. So it's just a fascinating, he traveled with his son, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, the author of the Tur. He himself became very close with the Abu Drum, that we'll come back to the Abu Drum later. But the Rush was a fascinating character in our Jewish tradition, a fascinating posek, and an important posek. And he gives us an answer to this question that is so surprising and yet so impactful. Says the Rush the following: V'sheshalta, and regarding that which you asked Lama ein mevarchen al sipur Haggadah, that why is there no blessing on telling over the story of the Haggadah, telling over the story of the Exodus? Says the Rush the following: Anu zochrin Yetzias Mitzrayim. Our obligation is to remember what happened in the land of Mitzrayim, and the fact that God took us out of the land of Egypt, and the fact that Hashem saved us. We have an obligation to remember this by telling over the story. However, says the Rush, the lav dafka Haggadah b'peh. However, the commandment is not to read a Haggadah. What is the Rush talking about? What essentially the Rush's answer is that there's no blessing to read the Haggadah because our obligation is not to read the Haggadah. Our obligation is to tell over the story. Number one, has that answered the question? But number two, what is the Rush talking about? There's no obligation to read the Haggadah. That in order to fulfill my obligation of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story of the Exodus, I don't need to read the Haggadah. What is the Rush talking about? The Rambam tells us, and the Rush agrees to the Rambam, that if a person finds themselves to be alone at a Seder, which we know too many found themselves alone at a Seder last year, and this year as well. It's an unfortunate reality that many still are going to be finding themselves alone at a Pesach Seder. And it wasn't just in last year and this year, but there are Jews all over the world that every single year find themselves alone at a Seder. But nevertheless, when a person is alone at a Seder, says the Rosh and says the Rambam that a person still needs to go through the same motions of the Seder. That the motions of the Seder, of the Haggadah, of asking questions and giving answers, and the answer of Avad Demayinu, going through the question-answer format, still needs to be kept and preserved, even if you're having that dialogue as a monologue with yourself. So if that's the case, and the Rosh says that that is the case, that one would still need to follow the exact directive of the Haggadah. So then if that's the case, why does the Rosh say, V'lav dafka Haggadah b'peh? That you don't need to make a blessing because there's really no specific structure to this mitzvah, and therefore there's no bracha because you don't really need to read the Haggadah. The Rosh, you're contradicting yourself. Yes, you do need to read the Haggadah. I mean, just raise your hand. Raise your hand if you don't read the Haggadah during the night of the Seder. Raise your hand if you don't go exactly through the order. It's nobody. Nobody. Who doesn't read the Haggadah? You have to read the Haggadah. You have to go through the exact motions that the Haggadah prescribes. How else would you fulfill the mitzvah of Sipri Tzis Mitzrayim, of telling over the story? What is the Rosh talking about? So says the Pri Megadim the following. The Pri Megadim, a super commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, writes, he says, our obligation the night of the Seder, while there are many, many motions that we go through, of Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, dipping the celery in the salt water, some people use a potato. You go through all the motions of the Seder, Magid, you then wash your hands, you then have matzah, maror, going through all of the different steps of the Seder, Hallel. Those steps, those motions, says the Pri Megadim, are motions we have to go through in order to elicit emotions. That the motions in and of themselves are significant. However, they really are means to an end. They're means to an end, and that end being that a person is supposed to experience something the night of the Seder. That the night of the Seder, the motions we go through are supposed to be motions that penetrate our heart, that penetrate our neshamas, that shape who we are in our relationship with God, in our relationship with our families, in our relationship with our friends, in our relationship with our community, in our relationship with Klal Yisrael, in my relationship with myself. That those motions are supposed to instill Emunah within us. Those motions are supposed to become emotions in order to instill proper Emunah. That's what the Rosh means. When the Rosh says, V'lav dafka Haggadah b'peh, he doesn't mean skip the Haggadah. What he means is the Haggadah is not the means in and of itself. The Haggadah is a means to an end. You have to go through every single step of the Haggadah, but you have to make sure that each of those steps go through you, that they have an effect on you. That's why there's no blessing on telling over the story, because telling over the story is not the mitzvah. You know what the mitzvah is? The mitzvah is tell the story so that the story informs your life, so that the story changes who you are, so that the story develops you and develops your relationships and develops your Emunah. We say in the Haggadah, B'chol dor vador, chayev adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, that in every single generation, that a person is obligated to view themselves as if they left Mitzrayim. Ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, That the whole purpose of the Seder is for us to go through the motions to get to a place that we too are experiencing cherus, that we too are experiencing freedom. That I go through Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachas, all the 15 beautiful steps of the Seder. I go through all of the different portions of Magid in order so that I can experience true freedom in my life. And that freedom means that I am not defined by the realities of the 11 o'clock news. I'm not defined by whatever is happening politically. I'm not defined by even something as severe as a pandemic. I'm not defined by my external surroundings. But what I am is a person that can choose to be free. What I am is a person that chooses to fulfill my mission in this world, my holy mission in this world, that God put me on this world to do. That I choose to learn Torah. I choose to have a relationship with God. I choose to be a good person that brings morality into the world. Ki'ilu hu yatzim mitzrayim, the same way that there was that paradigm shift. That the Jewish people at that moment in history were no longer defined by their external surroundings. They weren't defined as slaves to slave masters as the Egyptians, but rather now they are able to accomplish their mission in the world. That paradigm shift existed. We are obligated the night of the Seder to make sure that all of the motions we go through make an effect on us, for us to create that shift, for us to become people who choose cherus, who choose freedom, who choose to have the relationship with God necessary to fulfill my mission in the world. In source number 6, we see the famous statement from Rabbi Gamliel. The Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer, Rabbi Gamliel used to say, Kol shelo omer shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yotze yedei chavaso. And here we get to another one of the classic Reich family customs of the Seder, where my father would read this paragraph and say, Rabbi Gamliel teaches us that we have to make sure that we read and we say these 3 things. And if we don't fulfill our obligation. And then he would say, and everyone repeat after me, Ve'elu hein. Pesach, matzah, we'd all repeat matzah, umaror, and maror, and we'd all repeat, in order to make sure that we talk about these three hallmarks of eating the Paschal lamb, of eating matzah, eating maror. And the Haggadah goes into why it is we do these 3 things. And this is Rabbi Gamliel's mandate, that we have to learn why we eat the Pesach, the Karban Pesach, why it is we eat matzah, why it is that we eat maror. But one could recognize that Rabbi Gamliel's statement, it's very interesting, the type of language that he uses, that he writes it in the negative. Why doesn't he write it in the passive? He writes it in the negative of kol shelo omar, that anyone that does not say these 3 things during the Pesach Seder, lo yatza, does not fulfill their obligation. Why does he write it in the negative? He should write it in the positive. That whoever does say these things fulfills their obligation. Why does he say it in the negative? Because maybe Rabbi Gamliel is speaking to the passive member of the Seder. Speaking to the member of the Seder that's just simply going through those motions. Says Rabbi Gamliel that if you're going to continue to be passive through the Seder, you're not going to fulfill your obligation. You're not going to fulfill the obligation of turning those motions into emotions, of turning those motions into instilling a true sense of Emunah in my heart, of instilling a true sense of Torah values in my heart, of instilling a true sense of cherus in my heart. That if you're going to continue to be passive, you're not going to fulfill your Pesach obligations, your Seder obligations, your obligation of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story of the Exodus. Rather, you need to be active, and you have to say, Pesach, matzah, maror. You have to discuss why it is we eat a Paschal lamb and what that means to me in my life, how I can apply that to my life, how I can live a more meaningful life because of the fact that when a Beis Hamikdash stood, there was a Karban Pesach as the main course. And that I eat matzah. Why do I eat matzah? What does matzah represent? What does matzah represent? Not just tonight at the Seder, but to help define my life. Why do we eat maror? Because there are bitter things in life that happen. And nevertheless, we know that Hashem has a master plan. We have to talk about it. We have to be passive. We have to be active at the Seder, excuse me. Rabbi Gamliel is speaking to the passive participant. Don't let it happen. Don't let the Seder go by you. In order to fulfill your obligation of the Seder, you have to let it go through you. You can't just go through it. This, says the Maharal, is why we find that this mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story of the Exodus, does not have a cap. You know, if it was a mitzvah that had a very, very specific structure to it, that this is what you do, so then there'd be a cap of once you do it, so then it's done. Once you shake lulav, it's done. Once you eat matzah, it's done. Once you have blown the shofar, it's done. It doesn't exist by the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. As we've learned at the end of the paragraph of Avadim Ayinu, V'chol hamar b'lesaper, in source number 7, that anyone that tells more about the Exodus, that speaks more about it, that delves deeper into it, l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim harizem meshubach. This is praiseworthy. Because there is no cap. There is no cap to Emunah. There is no limit to how much the Seder can affect you deeply and profoundly, as long as you're not passive through it, as long as you're active and engaged through it, to see how I can instill Emunah in my life, how I can build myself into a person that chooses Chayrus despite everything that's going on around me, that I'm not stuck, but rather I'm unstuck. I'm not defined by those challenges that life presents, but rather I'm living life. I am fulfilling my mission in this world, and that those challenges are part of God's plan. Kol amar b'harizem meshubach. That anyone that talks more about it, that delves deeper into it, that is praiseworthy. In fact, says the Abu Dram, Rabbeinu David Abu Draham, who was a close friend of the son of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, the Tur, became very close with the Abu Dram when they were both living in Toledo, Spain. Says the Abu Dram that this is why we refer to the book, the manual that helps guide us through the Seder evening, as the Haggadah. That we know that term Haggadah is taken from the language of the Torah, that the Torah says the mitzvah of telling over the story is v'higadata lebincha, that we have to tell over the story to our children. But the Torah also refers to the narrative of Yetzias Mitzrayim, not only using the language of a Haggadah, but also as a sipur, as a story. Leman tesapter ba'oznei bincha, that we have an obligation to tell over the story. If that's the case, why do we call the pamphlet, the booklet, the guidebook a Haggadah? Why don't we call it hasipur? Because the night of the Seder, it's not enough just to simply tell a story, but there needs to be a Haggadah. There needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be a back and forth. There needs to be a depth to it that goes beyond just the plot of Yetzias Mitzrayim. But it gets to what's between the lines. It gets to how that story affects me and informs me in my life. You know how you do that? Through v'higadata lebincha. In fact, that's the source pasuk for how I know that I am obligated to view myself as if I am leaving Mitzrayim, is from this pasuk of v'higadata lebincha, of telling over the story in this kind of an active way, and this kind of a way with depth. V'higadata lebincha bayom hahu, says the Torah, le'mor ba'avur zeh, that because of this, asa Hashem li, God has done this for me, because I am experiencing this every single year, that every single generation, it gets passed over and on and on and on through the line. It becomes something that gets implanted into the heart of every single generation, all the way since Yetzias Mitzrayim 3,300 years ago. Because when it comes to instilling Emunah, it needs to be something that has depth to it. something that turns God from a concept into a reality, the goal of the Seder night. We can't let the Seder, the motions of the Seder just pass us by. We have to be active. We have to capitalize on those opportunities. And it can totally affect who we are. Not just Seder night, but who we are from then on out. Helping to inform our lives to be able to make a choice of chayros, a choice of freedom, as opposed to allowing the realities of life define who we are, allowing what happens on the 11 o'clock news and in politics, and even with something as severe as a pandemic, define who we are. But rather, we choose chayros, because chayros, freedom, is a choice. So while that's all well and good, the night of the Seder, it's beautiful, it's uplifting, it's what this rush is inspiring, that I'm not going to be passive, but you know what? It's one night a year. How's it enough for it to last? It's one night a year. It's inspirational, it's motivational, it's aspirational, but it's one night a year. How do we make it something that's lasting? So the Torah, of course, has an antidote. That you remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, you remember the experience of the Seder every single day. Leman Tizkor, says the Torah in source number 10, Leman Tizkor es Yom Tzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. That we have an obligation to remember the day we left Mitzrayim every single day. We have an obligation to remember what happens at the Seder every single day of the year. Leman Tizkor es Yom Tzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. Every single day, we have to remember what happened. So how do we do that? How does that work? Yeah, I get it. I get it that the night of the Seder is really impactful and could be really, really motivational. It can help define who I am, and it can help me teach me how to choose chayros, how to choose freedom, how to choose relationship with Hashem to the point that God is a reality in my life. I get that, and that I understand that I should remember it every single day. But how does that juxtaposition work? How does it work with itself? How do we accomplish the goal that the Torah is expecting of us? So says the Ha'amek Davar, the Nitsif, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, took the helm of the Volozhin Yeshiva in 1854. He took the helm, and at that moment that he took the helm, he devoted himself to the yeshiva to the point that the yeshiva had a major boom. It became the model yeshiva in all of Europe. And I believe even today, everyone aspires to be Volozhin. The Volozhin yeshiva is headed by the Nitsif. Now, the Nitsif, unfortunately, had to make a decision in 1892 due to government regulations by the Board of Education that really limited their capacities as a yeshiva to learn Torah. They unfortunately had to make a decision to close the yeshiva. This decision from the Nitsif in 1892 was so difficult for him that it actually affected him physically. It literally made him sick, and he passed away while getting medical treatment in Warsaw in 1893. Now, the Nitsif in Volozhin, during those glory days of the Volozhin yeshiva, the Nitsif would give a Friday morning Parsha Shir. And this was one of the most popular classes of the entire curriculum of the Volozhin Yeshiva. It was very, very well attended. These classes were later turned and compiled into the Sefer Ha'amek Davar, the commentary on the Torah, written by the Nitsif. So the Nitsif tells us how we accomplish this goal. How we accomplish the goal of making sure that the Seder night is something that sticks with us, and to accomplish the goal that making sure every single day we could recall the Seder night, we can recall Yetziat Mitzrayim in order to make sure that it sticks with us every single day until we come back full circle to the Seder again. Says the Nitziv the following, Kamosha Av Mesaper Lebno Maisa Sheyesh Bo Musar. He says it's like an important story that a father A parent will tell over to their son, to their child. And it's an important story, a story with life lesson and direction. But it's an extremely long story. It's an important story. It's a fundamental story. And I'm sure all of you, myself included, have had stories in our lives, experiences in our lives, people that we've met, family stories, whatever it might be, from a parent, a grandparent, a mentor, a teacher, a Rebbe, that it was a story that affected who we are. An incredibly important story. B'chol yom, and says the Nitsif, every single day, the good parent, what they'll do, maskio beremes kal kol asipur, they'll figure out a way to be able to remind their child of this incredibly important story every single day, like a bow around the finger. That you, or with a catchphrase, with a word, they can sum up the entire story in that one word or that one symbol in order to rush it all back. B'chol shana, however, every single year, chozer masaper mechadash, we go back and we revisit the entire story brand new. In order to make sure that the story becomes implanted into the heart of their child. Kach mitzvah. So too, says the Nitsif, is the obligation we have Seder night. Seder night, he says that we have an obligation, l'saper, to tell over this whole long story the night of the Pesach Seder. We tell over with all of its details and all the accoutrement with the Pesach Matzah Maror. We have the Magid, Kaddish, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, going through everything, Hallel, all of the pieces, the entire structure. We eat Matzah, Maror, everything. We do that once a year. We have that experience once a year. But every single day, when we say the Shema, and we recognize the fact that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, it should bring back, through this hint, it should bring back the entire experience again of what it felt like to be that close with Hashem, what it felt like to have true Emunah, what it felt like to have the ability to choose Chirus, to choose freedom. Now, I myself, in my own personal life, had such an experience. And one of the last times I had the opportunity to see my grandmother, Sarah Bat Amos, Allah Shalom, as she became very, very sick over Hanukkah, the year that she passed away. And so my father calls me up and he says, listen, the doctors are saying that Savta does not have much time and you really have to get here as quick as possible. That was at Congregation Adat Yeshurun. I went from Congregation Adat Yeshurun, La Jolla, California, to my home, just a couple blocks away, where Brooke already had a bag packed for me. I had a flight booked just a couple hours later. I went from there to San Diego International Airport, from San Diego International Airport to Newark Airport, from Newark Airport to Robert Wood Johnson Medical Center in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in exactly that order, to go see my Savta for one last time. So I see my father, and it's me, my father, and my grandmother. My grandmother, unfortunately, is unresponsive. She has not moved in quite some time. She has not spoken in quite some time. She has no strength. And at this point, what was going on medically with my grandmother is that the doctors were making a choice. They gave an option of doing a very, very risky procedure it was almost like a long shot, try and save her. It was like almost like a heroic position to try and save her life. And they asked my father, what do you want to do? Do you want to do the surgery or not? And he, it's not a position that any child ever wants to be in, especially when they don't have the ability to consult with their parent, the patient. But unfortunately, my father did not have that luxury. And thank God, God gives my father a lot of wisdom. And he decided that they were going to move forward with the surgery. And during this moment that I had just came to the room and I was with my father and my grandmother, It was a few moments later, my grandmother actually gained just a semblance of consciousness, just enough that my father, with his wisdom, wanted to capitalize on that opportunity and said, Ima, and filled her in on everything that was going on with her medically, filled her in on what the doctors are talking about on this potential procedure that's going to take place. And he asked her, he said, do you want to do this surgery? And my grandmother, with all of the strength that she had, which was almost none, just firmly shook her head, yes. And then I don't know what motivated my father to ask this question, but I'm forever grateful that my father did ask this question. My father turns to my Savta and says, Ima, alo mefachedet. You're not scared? And my grandmother, with the last bit of strength that she had, all she did was shake her head, no. And then she just lifted her right finger, shaking, lifting her right finger as if to point to Hashem, to say, there's nothing ever to be afraid of because we have Emunah. Now that moment was perhaps one of the most impactful moments of my life. Being able to witness that level of Emunah, of God being a reality with zero fear. And in my family, now since my grandmother's passing, if any one of us is anxious, nervous, scared, feeling challenged, threatened, whether it be myself, one of my siblings, cousins, even one of my parents, all you have to do in the Reich family is, as the Nitsif said, give a hint that sums up the entire story. All you have to do is lift one finger. In the Reich family, this means the entire Pesach Seder experience, the entire experience of recognizing what true Emunah is. All you have to do is just lift one finger. God willing, this Pesach, I hope that all of us are able to, as we said from the Rush, not just go through the motions of the Seder, but turn those motions into emotions. Make sure that we're not being passive through the Seder, as Rabbi Gamliel said, that we're being active through the Seder, that we're capitalizing on the opportunities that the Seder gives us in order to live meaningful, impactful lives, and that experience of the Seder gets implanted in our hearts. And that every single day when we say the Shema, we can come back and recognize that we have a choice, that we can choose freedom. We can choose to be the best versions of ourselves, to be B'nai Torah, that we choose to learn Torah, to have a relationship with God, to have true v'yahavta l'recha kamocha, to have true achdus amongst Klal Yisrael, to do what I can to make this world a better place, to bring a Kiddush Hashem to the world, to help my neighbors, to help my friends, to help each other. And it brings me back every single day to that recognition, to that certainty I had the night of the Seder, as if we're lifting a finger to Hashem and saying, I know what's right, I know what's true, and I'm going to choose to do it. And that 1 week later, and 2 weeks later, post-Seder, and then even a month after the Seder, we still are able to bring ourselves back to that moment. But as time goes on, it's going to get a little bit more phasey. And it's going to get a little more hazy and a little more fuzzy, and it's going to be not as clear. 6 months down the road, 8 months down the road, until eventually we're getting to this time of year again. and we're getting closer to the Seder, and bringing ourselves back to what it was like a year ago, to feel a real sense of Emunah is getting harder and harder. But then that's why we have another Seder, to make sure it gets deeper and deeper and deeper rooted into our hearts. What true Chayrus is, what true freedom is, what true Emunah is, how I can live a most meaningful life, a most impactful life. And that I always remember that freedom, that Chayrus, is a choice, and a choice that, God willing, I'm going to make the Seder night, and that the Seder night is going to be the first of 365 times I'm going to make that choice over and over and over again. I wish everyone a beautiful, meaningful, uplifting Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a yontiv filled with turning our relationship with God from a concept into a reality that can inform every single day of our lives. Good yontiv.